Why in the world are you going there? Don't you know those people hate us? And I couldn't believe that people had this response, because to me, Palestinian people are they're people just like everyone else around the world, but they're being systematically oppressed.
The way we are controlled is very simple. They keep us frightened. Used to be the Kaiser, then Hitler, then Stalin, now the Muslims, next to them the Chinese. They keep us divided, men and women, black and white, Muslim, Christian and Jew. They keep us demoralized. That's what the educational system and the league table is about. And they encourage cynicism. And in that way hope to control us. And I think if you are going to establish your rights, you have to begin by being absolutely clear you are not frightened, not divided, not demoralized, and not cynical, and then you can make progress.
This is for Palestine, Ramallah, West Bank, Gaza. This is for the child that is searching for an answer. Wish I could take your tears and replace them with laughter. Long live Palestine, long live
Good
Gaza.
morning, and thank you for flying Air International, flight number 103.1 FM. A place where you're sure to fly first class every time you fly. Ask me why the flight is first class. It's our passengers. And today we have Kylie Stephens. She's a master's candidate in peace and conflict studies with a concentration in international development. She is taking us to Palestine and Israel during this flight. And she's been working with a group called the Interfaith Peace Builders. So, Kylie, how does the Interfaith Peace Builders use narrative as a modality for transforming peace? And what are some of their projects that you are working on?
Thank you. So the Interfaith Peace Builders primarily takes delegations of Americans and Canadians over to Israel and Palestine, and narrative is a really big part of what they do. So on the ground there, our delegation spent most of the time hearing from Palestinians, especially activist groups and NGOs, and really hearing their stories about what it's like to live in Palestine, to work in Palestine, and to advocate for the Palestinian people.
Okay, and also in talking earlier, we talked about the refugee camps, the homes now that have been built in the refugee camps. Can you paint a picture of what it's like to live in the kind of refugee camp that you stayed in while you were there?
Yes, so the refugee camp that I was in, and actually I stayed in one, visited two, but they're not refugee camps in the traditional sense that we think of here in the West. It's no longer tents. These refugee camps have been there since 1948, so that was the first wave of refugees, and expanded again in 1967. So now these camps are primarily concrete structures. So it started out, the UN gave them these little concrete buildings for families to live in, and then as the families grew, they built more structures on top of the original ones. So these are just concrete buildings that have been built on top of each other and in very, very close proximity to each other. So very narrow streets, not a whole lot of ability to unfortunately clean up trash, have services in these areas, because it wasn't set up for that. So imagine that type of living since 1948, and that the homes themselves, hopefully there will never be a natural disaster, but something like an earthquake, like what we just saw in Iran, could be really, really devastating.
I know in one of our classes we also talked about the border negotiations between the Palestinians and Israelis. Can you talk just briefly about that?
So I think as far as water negotiations, from my experience there, the biggest thing that stood out as far as water was that as you're driving through the West Bank, sometimes it really can be very difficult to tell where a settlement is and where Palestinian homes are. But what I learned was that the easiest way to tell the difference was whether or not a home had a cistern on the roof. So you'd see these big cisterns on top of Palestinian homes, and you wouldn't see them on the Israeli homes because they're hooked up to water. They have access almost unlimited water, whereas the Palestinians have to live with these cisterns on their roofs.
Palestinians, and you have 25% who would be Israelis, and the Israelis would get that 75% of water, whereas the Palestinians would get 25% of that water.
Yep, that's absolutely correct. Actually, when we went north into the West Bank, and we did a homestay with a family, and of course they have the cistern on their roof. And while we were there, 7 of us stayed together in this family home. Such wonderful family, great people. I had a great time, but we were very, very conscious of we didn't shower while we were there. We used as little water as possible because we know they only get their water refilled once a month.
One of the things that I wanted to talk about that you were sharing with me earlier was a different way of ethnic cleansing. Usually we think of ethnic cleansing as genocide. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so when I spoke about ethnic cleansing earlier, obviously there is a lot of violence in that region. Unfortunately, Palestinian youth are often killed by Israeli military forces in clashes that they have. But when I meant ethnic cleansing, I meant it less in a systematic way of just killing people, and more in making living there so miserable and so difficult that people leave, or they just shut down emotionally. And so it's impacting the population in a way that you're not necessarily killing them. You're making them emotionally, you're beating them down emotionally to the point that almost that they don't feel human, to make them feel very, low and feel like second-class citizens, even in their own country. I mean, this is supposed to be Palestine, and they're getting mistreated by the Israelis in their own land.
Is there a lot of suicide in that area?
I actually don't know the answer to that question. That's a really good question. It wasn't something that was brought up while we were there, so I can't speak to that. But as far as ethnic cleansing, I think it's this very slow process of beating down a population, and I think ultimately hoping that they'll just leave, and applying force when force is not at all needed.
You told me earlier that there was a difference between the way Arab Jews and European Jews, and can you tell me or let our listeners know about the invitation of Arab Jews coming into Israel and then how they were treated afterwards?
Yeah, so on our last day of the delegation, we met with a gentleman who talked about his experience growing up in Israel and moving there from Morocco. His family is an Arab Jewish family, and basically after the creation of Israel, it was my understanding that they wanted more Jewish families to come and live in the Holy Land. So there was this push for Jewish people to move into Israel from all over the world. And so his family was one of those that came from Morocco. And what they discovered when they got there is that Moroccan and other Arab Jewish families like theirs were moved into what really amounted to slums, while their European Jewish counterparts were basically the ruling class. Another thing to point out is that there are also Palestinian Jews that had lived in the area for centuries. They didn't move there. They were indigenous to the region, so an indigenous Jewish population as well. And some of them were forced out, became refugees, along with their Palestinian brothers and sisters that were both Christian and Muslim. although many, at least what I understood, many of the Palestinian Jewish people have now been able to remain in Israel, there are some Palestinian Jewish families that do remain as refugees as well. They identify as Palestinian first and Jewish second, so they still practice their religion, but they identify as Palestinian primarily.
Can you speak on the Palestinian view of this being a religious war?
Yeah, so the one thing I heard echoed by, I'd say, almost every Palestinian that I spoke to was that from their perspective, this is not a religious war or a religious conflict. So like I mentioned earlier, there were Palestinian Christians, Jews, and Muslims in the region. And prior to the creation of Israel, for the most part, those indigenous people got along regardless of their religion. So they lived in small towns and villages together. They lived in Jerusalem together, where there are many holy sites, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim holy sites, all within 5 to 10 minutes walking distance of each other. And prior to Zionism, they lived together peacefully. I can't speak towards how the Israelis view the conflict, especially Orthodox Israeli Jews. I think they might see it as more of a religious conflict because they see this as their land, as granted to them by God. So they might see it more as a religious conflict than the Palestinians do. That's conjecture on my part. But again, most Palestinians I spoke to said they remember, especially the older populations, they remember growing up and living peacefully with, whether they're Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, they live together peacefully.
If this is not a religious war, what kind of war do you think, or do you believe the Palestinians believe that this is?
I think they think it's more of a political conflict and a power conflict. So after the Balfour Declaration, that was more of a way for for Europe to try and push their Jewish population into the region.
And for our listeners, can you let them know what the Balfour Declaration is?
The Balfour Declaration was written by, but the Balfour Declaration basically assured the Jewish people that there would eventually be a Jewish state created in what was British mandated Palestine. It was written in 1917. So actually, while I was there was the 100-year anniversary of the Balfour Declaration.
Earlier, we talked about the knocking down of the refugee homes, for lack of a better word. And you also shared with me a young man sleeping on a couch in front of his home, I'm assuming because there really isn't enough room in the home to house everyone. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so first about some of the destruction of homes, specifically in the refugee camps. So as you're going through a refugee camp, you'll see what looks like something that's just been bulldozed over, and it was explained to us that so this doesn't happen as frequently right now, but it still does happen. But if there is someone in the refugee camp that the Israeli military wanted for whatever reason, maybe it's a legitimate reason, maybe it's not a legitimate reason, which is often the case, what they used to do is...
Or who was an activist.
Oh, yes, or who was an activist, exactly. What they used to do is they would basically bulldoze every house in front of whichever home that person was in. So they would destroy all these homes leading up to that person's house. So they didn't really care that they were knocking down innocent people's homes on the way to getting this supposed, maybe they'd call him a terrorist. In the case of the young man that was sleeping out on his couch in front of his house, because you're correct, there was not enough room for him in the home. I do think it was, my understanding is the Israeli military was coming for him because he was an activist, a peaceful activist. He had actually been doing a lot of artwork and also setting up book exchanges for Palestinian youth in the refugee camp. And my understanding is he was sleeping on his couch. The Israeli military blew open the door to his family home, not seeing him laying on the couch. Of course, when his family door's home was blown off the hinges, he hopped up and started running, because that's what you would do if you heard an explosion in the middle of the night. And he was shot in the back. They would have to accept a large number of Palestinians into Israel as Israeli citizens, and that would change the demographic. It would no longer be an Israeli state. You'd have the majority of the people would be Palestinian. They'd be ethnically Palestinian. So then you have what was initially a Jewish state, but it is no longer a majority Jewish people, and I think that would be a problem for Israel.
But would it be a problem if they were trying to create laborers?
Oh, well, if they're trying to just create a labor class, I mean, I guess you could look at it that way, but it wouldn't be a democratic state. If they want to continue to be looked upon by the rest of the world as truly democratic, you have to give full rights to everyone. You have to give voting power to all the Palestinians that they would absorb. And I think very quickly, Palestinians would exercise their right to vote, and we'd see a big change. And I think that's what Israel is afraid of.
Okay, so we're getting ready to land, and I'd like to ask you, what would you have our listeners know based upon your experiences, one, and what areas of improvement do you see that need to be addressed? There may be a lot. However, what 2 areas do you think need to be addressed? And what would you have our listeners know based upon your experiences?
So the first thing I'd have the listeners know is that, so first I'll speak towards my experience prior to leaving. When I told people I was going to Israel and Palestine, when I got to the Palestine part here in America, the response I got from Americans when I said I was going to Palestine was, "Why in the world are you going there? Don't you know those people hate us?" And I couldn't believe that people had this response, because to me, Palestinian people are they're people just like everyone else around the world, but they're being systematically oppressed, and they're not terrorists. They are simply people using any means to try and gain their rights. And so I think the first thing I'd have people know is, this struggle that we hear about in Palestine, it's not, like I said earlier, it's not necessarily a religious struggle. They're not terrorists. They're people that want their rights just like anyone else. Areas of improvement, I guess, talking to a Western or American audience here, I think areas for improvement would be looking at our own government and knowing that we give so much money to Israel. We are the primary, we give the most money out of any country in the world to Israel, and primarily to their military, is to be more aware of this and write your senators and make noise about the fact that we're funding a nation that is oppressing other people, especially in Palestine. We bill ourselves as, or at least some people bill ourselves as a Christian nation, yet we're giving money that's tearing apart the so-called Holy Land.
Kylie, you've given us a lot to think about, and I want to thank you for flying Air International, flight number 103.1 FM. And I look forward to you coming on again. I look forward to you flying with us again.
Thank you for having me.